So it was good to hear the responses to some of the people in my group to the question, and that it was something that they actually, these issues of detachment and emotional numbing were things that they had to deal with in their life. And it was a part of their spiritual practice, and it was a part of a problem of growth and of finding their own way. So that was good to hear. So I think we're all back and we can keep moving, because I'm running a bit behind schedule. So we better keep going so we don't want to miss out on all the good memes. So the next thing is following Robert Masters' list of spiritual bypassing tendencies is hyperpositivity, which is something you might be familiar with, especially in consciousness circles, yoga circles, or New Age, spiritual kind of communities. There's always this good vibes only, love and light, thoughts and prayers. It's the law of attraction. It's this idea that if you're positive and you give out love and light to the world, that's what you'll get back. But you are the one who manifests your reality. And if you've got a bad reality, it's your fault. Of course, this is being fed by social media, by the illusions of Instagram, by Facebook fantasies, by filters and exotic backdrops and carefully constructed stories that aren't necessarily real. So of course, this kind of mindset, we only want good vibes, we only have love and light, is this kind of place of a pleasant, safe bubble that we put ourselves in. We don't want to connect with things that are bad, that are unhappy, that are sad. We want to avoid the suffering of other people's suffering. We want to avoid our own suffering. We just want to have the good stuff. So this is actually a tuning out rather than a tuning in. When we tune in, we see things in a balanced way. We see the suffering and the happiness of life. But when we tune out and we only want to filter out the suffering, then we're missing out on an opportunity to grow. Of course, this denies the complexity of the world, and it denies the very real suffering that exists, such as war, famine, abuse, violence. So these things are real and they're happening right now, and we can't deny their existence by pretending that they're not there. So of course, if we don't acknowledge that there's problems in our own life and other people's lives, then how on earth can we help create change? And of course, the feelings that we have, if we make other people feel bad that their life is not perfect or that they've got some suffering, then people will start to hide their pain, start to hide their hurt, start to hide their true feelings in order to not make other people feel uncomfortable. And so again, yes, this idea of social media especially, or Hollywood movies or books or whatever it is, creating a false expectation of reality. So what does this look like? Some memes to help explain. So here we have someone saying, every time someone sends me love and light, and this person's like, oh God, not again. Please stop, it's too much. My heart chakra. So this is the image that I have in my head every time I see someone signing off with love and light, or something like that on Facebook or wherever it is. This is the image that I get in my mind, this poor person being loved and lighted to death. And So here we have all these switches saying, do something, do something, do something. And of course, someone sending thoughts and prayers, which is a kind of bit of a cop-out, really, when people need food or water, just to send thoughts and prayers. Or this idea that, if people have a low vibration, which is something you encounter these terms in spiritual communities, consciousness communities, that things like bad mood or anger or sadness is low vibration, and trying to deny that person's authentic feeling, saying we don't do that here. And part of this hyperpositivity is faking it, covering up your authentic feelings with positivity so that no one notices you're on the verge of a nervous breakdown, or covering up your true feelings with some sort of pretense of spirituality. And I like this diagram, this Venn diagram, which sums up the problem with this way of thinking. If you think that you can have no bad vibes, or that you can only be positive 100% of the time, then the reality is you are missing out on the very complex nature and the reality of human experience. So this is something I see quite a lot in Buddhist circles, is that we like to shut down other people if they're not having a good time. And the reason, as I said before, is because other people's suffering makes us uncomfortable. Other people's suffering makes us suffer. And so we want to create this fake world where everyone is in a good place all the time, or that we want to convince ourselves that because we're spiritual people, we have the answers. We have the teachings which prevent us from suffering, that we are above low vibes, that we, because we're spiritual people, have some sort of extra protection that prevents these things from happening to us. And so we might feel that we have to perform a fake positivity, because spiritual people can't be sad, spiritual people can't be depressed, spiritual people can't be needy or hurt or lonely. Spiritual people have to be happy the whole time. Otherwise, what's the point? And so you can see this dilemma that we have. And sometimes you go to a yoga studio, or to a Buddhist group or a spiritual community, and you get the vibe that you have to be positive, you have to be happy, you have to put on your happy face, you have to fake it till you make it. And so this is a problem, because as those slides show, it's it's just covering up. It's just like a filter on Instagram. It's just changing the background without actually doing the work that's needed to support growth, to support the change that we need to make in our life, so that we can feel that positivity authentically. But I don't think that we're going to be happy 100% of the time, simply because we're human, and we need to understand, we need to recognize that our experiences shouldn't be limited to a narrow band of feelings that other people have told us equals spirituality. So be aware of consciousness communities that kind of make you feel guilty if you're having a bad day, or friends who won't let you be yourself around them because you're going through a hard time. Be aware of not allowing yourself to feel these things Be aware of covering up. Be aware of faking positivity. So this is the problem with hyper positivity, that it is this mask, a masquerade, a spiritual performance that we might be compelled to do. And the net effect of that is you end up feeling like a bit of a fraud. You end up feeling like you haven't made it as a spiritual person. You feel guilty that you have these teachings. The teachings talk about escaping suffering, and that you've been on the spiritual path for so long, and yet from time to time you get depressed, or from time to time you get sad, or that you still experience things like hurt and pain, and you might think that this is not allowed, this is not good, it's a sign that you're sliding backwards, that you're not a good spiritual practitioner. But actually, it's the narrowness of the definition that we've given ourselves of what spiritual life means that is the problem, that we haven't allowed ourselves to see the full experience of humanness as spiritual, and that we've turned something where we should learn from these experiences into a kind of fraudulent cover-up. And when we do that, when we fake it, when we're not authentic, then we're not going to be able to see what it means to sit with those feelings, to be okay with those feelings, to understand them, to see how they arose, why they arose, to understand how it creates pain and suffering in our hearts, to not feel great the whole time, we're missing out on the opportunity to transform those through wisdom, and we're just using will and denial to cover up and fake it. So I hope that makes sense. We'll keep going with the slideshow. Oh, will we? I've just lost control of my computer. Okay. Good. The complexity of human experience. Yeah, so often I think it's like we're part of an ad for a spiritual corporation or something, that we have to, laugh all the time and be happy all the time. And yeah, maybe that's not the best way to be. Similar is this idea of anger phobia, that we should not experience anger, because anger is not spiritual. Anger is negative, toxic, low vibe. We should never, ever get angry. Conflict is bad and should be avoided. So often this is people telling us these things, of course, like when we're angry or we're resentful or we have some frustration, people will come from a very judgmental place and tell us that we shouldn't ever get angry. You mustn't get angry. And I'm thinking in particular of last year when the Black Lives Matter protests started happening. People were saying, oh, I'm so angry, that racism exists like this in this day and age. And I remember someone was like, in this comment on this thread was like, oh, but we mustn't ever get angry. And it was like a person kind of clutching their pearls, that it was much worse to get angry than it was to have to endure systemic racism. And so this is a denial often of people's legitimate emotional reaction to unfair, hurtful, abusive situations. When we shut down people and we say, oh, you shouldn't be angry about that. Angry people aren't spiritual people. Sure, you were hurt, but you shouldn't be angry. Sure, you got abused, but you shouldn't be angry. How does this feel, do you think, to those people who are experiencing that? It's very easy when you're in a place of relative privilege and safety to judge other people, but when these things happen to you, it's much more difficult. So of course, this doesn't distinguish between different types of feelings, like ill will, resentment, hurt, frustration. These things are all lumped together as if it was one big thing, a big problem, one big emotion. But when we kind of break these things down, there's different forms that this kind of feeling has of anger or ill will or frustration, resentment. It's all slightly different. And actually we can learn from distinguishing these kinds of emotions by observing them rather than pushing them away. We can see how they work, how they function, how they feel, and understand them. And then we can let go of them much easier because we see them more clearly. Importantly, anger is sometimes part of a process. So anger might be something that we feel initially that can subside. We can change the way we feel about something. Time will heal, but we shouldn't just kind of push it away prematurely before acknowledging it or dealing with it. Because anger sometimes tells us that something is not right. We get angry because of things like injustice or because people are hurting or abusing us. And when we feel anger, sometimes it's because something isn't right. And of course, the suppression of anger is harmful. Why? Because it comes out eventually. And we know this. We understand how this can work. There's two things here. One is suppression, where we consciously suppress our anger or our frustration. We count to 10. This is a conscious act. But repression is when we unconsciously deny the impulses. It's where we put on the cheerful front because we know that this is how we're supposed to be. This is that false positivity, hyperpositivity, kind of covering up a true emotion. And this can become a habit where people end up hiding parts of themselves. And this is often a traumatic response as well. And so what happens is we feel scared, we feel angry, but we don't think it's spiritual. So we pretend that it's not happening. Where does it come from? I should have given you a trigger warning. This is quite a confronting slide. So here we have two people chopping up a body, and it does look rather uncomfortable, doesn't it? This, of course, is a very famous Buddhist simile. It's the simile of the saw. And it's one of the probably most quoted suttas that I can think of where it talks about anger and hate. And the advice from the Buddha is that even if someone was cutting you up limb by limb, you shouldn't give rise to any hate, that you should have a mind of love and compassion. And starting with the person who's cutting you up, you have a mind of love and compassion, and then you extend that to all living beings. And this is how you should train. Of course, this is an ideal, and if we're not quite there, if we don't have a mind that's able to endure this cutting up of our body, then we might feel like we're not very good spiritual practitioners. We might feel that we've failed at being spiritual. But this is an ideal version that the Buddha gives, and often it's mistaken for a literal teaching, and we need to be exactly like that. In the situation that the Buddha was talking in this sutta, it's actually referring to verbal insults that might be received by someone. And the Buddha uses this image in the sutta as a way to talk about how you might be able to endure these kinds of insults. Imagine it was like someone cutting you up. But some people actually think that this is the way that we should practice, that, you know, if someone was to cut off your finger, hack you up by limb, you shouldn't give rise to any hate. And of course, there's going to be a bit of a challenge for most of us. And so we need to maybe balance out the ideal with the reality. And one of the things that I frequently talk about when I talk about anger and ill will is to just reassure people that anger is something that doesn't disappear until very high stages along the path. It doesn't disappear until stages of enlightenment are attained. And this is something that's good to know, because it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to overcome our anger, or doesn't mean that we shouldn't deal with our hate. It just means that it's going to be there for some time yet. If you're not on the path to enlightenment, the stage that it disappears is the anagami stage, the non-returner. And this is very, very high at the end of the spiritual path. And if you were to imagine like going off to a journey to the moon, getting to this stage where anger is abandoned is when you're touched down on the moon in the spaceship and the lunar landing module. And then that one last step out onto the moon surface, that's arahant, that's full enlightenment. And so you see it's very close, yeah? And here we are back on Earth. We're still reading the instructions to build our spaceship, if we've even thought about getting up into space at all. And so anger is something that will last a long time in our spiritual journey, something that we need to work on, sure, but it's not something that we need to suppress. It's not something that we need to repress. It's something that we need to understand. And we understand it not through wishing that it wasn't there, by pushing it away. We understand it by experiencing it, by seeing the suffering that is involved in anger, and by letting it go as quickly as we can, not forcing it away, but letting it go. It's quite different. And so the Buddha said that when anger comes into the mind, we have three choices that are kind of like an inscription. So the first kind of person that gets angry, that's like an inscription, an inscription is like an etching or a line or something that's drawn in a surface. So the first person is someone who is like a line drawn in a rock, carved in a rock. So this someone who anger kind of sticks around with a really long time. It's almost like a permanent kind of anger, yeah? The second is like a line drawn in sand. So a line drawn in sand, maybe the water will calm or the wind will wipe it away eventually. So it doesn't stay too long, it can disappear. But the best person, the best kind of inscription is like a line drawn in the water. And this line, as soon as it's drawn, it disappears, just like that. And so sometimes when anger comes into our mind, if we just push it away and don't feel it or experience it, we don't recognize it as suffering, we don't see the drawbacks, we don't allow ourselves to authentically experience what, I guess, nature is trying to tell us, a situation is trying to tell us, then we miss this opportunity, and we also miss an opportunity to let it go, because we need to recognize it, we need to see it, we need to understand it, and then let it go. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have anger. I'm not saying that anger is not a problem, that anger is not an issue, that problems don't come from having anger. Of course it does. Many problems stem from having anger. But what I want us to do is not suppress it, but to recognize it and to understand it with wisdom, not willpower, and to let it go in your own way, in your own time. And I think this is an important part of that process, like just to understand that we need to let it go, sure, but it will happen sometimes over time for some people, for some events, some things that still, even today, I feel quite angry about when they come up into my mind. Like I see it, and you know, it's sticky and it's suffering. I know that, but I can't force it away. I just have to be with it, understand it, and try to let it go. But maybe something that we have to do over and over and over again. And we need to let it go over and over and over again. But we don't beat anger by suppressing it. We don't beat anger by repressing it. We also don't beat anger by expressing it. We need to observe it calmly and clearly, and not allow it to take over our mind, but not allow our mind to kind of squash it so that we don't even recognize it's there. Because the problem is that people who repress anger and suppress it, they'll explode sooner or later. And I remember my teachers talking about this, this problem in monasteries, that the people you've got to watch out for are the ones who are emotionally numbing and scarily calm and excessively peaceful. And these people, they said, will always end up exploding. And when they do explode, and I've also seen this, when these calm people who are just trying to hold it together, when they do explode, it can be spectacular. So that's the simile of the saw. So let's keep our spirituality grounded in reality and watch out for going towards these idealized utopian kind of extremes. Of course, like I say, we don't want to encourage anger or hate, but we need to understand it and see it clearly for what it is, but be authentic. And so this, I think, kind of sums up what I was trying to say. Anger is a bit like shit in our pocket when you think about it, or hate is a bit like shit in our pocket. It's sticky and it stinks, and we don't want to have it, but we need to just acknowledge that it's there and deal with it and heal with it, and then when we're ready, we need to let it go. So we've got two more things to look at, and then we'll have another breakout session. And these two things are linked, actually, and they're, I guess, the flip side of anger as well. But they're part of what happens if we suppress our real emotions. So the first one here is blind compassion. So it's saying something like, just turn the other cheek if someone hurts you. Turn a blind eye to people's faults. Never judge others. Have compassion for those who hurt you and others. They're the real victims. This is something you often hear in spiritual circles. People will say, if you've been hurt by someone, that the person who hurt you is the real victim because they're suffering and causing suffering, and that we should feel more compassion for them because they're the ones who are really suffering. What happens, though, is this means that compassion can sometimes become a spiritual excuse to allow harmful behavior, such as physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. And you see this in spiritual communities where there's been some abuse that has occurred by a leader or by people in the community, and instead of dealing with it properly, reporting it to the police or whatever appropriate measures should be taken, they've just forgiven and had compassion for the perpetrator and allowed for the abuse to continue. This is something that happened in a lot of Christian schools and homes in Australia and around the world, where priests and clergy were abusing children, and their spiritual communities forgave them and had compassion for them and just moved them on to another place and let them continue this kind of abuse. So this is why this is blind compassion. It's not skillful. It's not wise. It's not grounded in a sense of wisdom. One of the problems for us, of course, is that we want to be the bigger person all the time. We want to be the nice, kind, good, spiritual person. And so sometimes we forgive and we also forget. Sometimes this compassion can be a spiritual performance that we do. It's not actually genuine. We feel perhaps that we should have compassion for people or forgive, or we feel like we need to make this kind of step in this direction, which is true, we do, but it might not be genuine. We might feel forced into this kind of compassion. One of the problems is, of course, that if you are in a community where you're obliged to forgive actions, speech, behaviors, and you aren't allowed to talk about being accountable for those actions, speech, or behaviors, then it shuts down legitimate problems. It shifts the blame from the person who has created harm and puts it onto the people who experience that harm. So this is a big problem you often see in spiritual communities where there's been some abuse by a teacher, that the people who complain are told you should have compassion, you should forgive, and they become the problem rather than the person who created the abuse. And it means that we are not authentic to the feelings that we might have. If we have to go straight for 100% compassion, then we might be doing it out of fear. We might be doing it out of worry for being confrontational. We might be worried that people will think of us as judgmental or unspiritual. And as I said before, we might try to impose compassion on other people before they're ready for that stage of response. What this does is values compassion for other people sometimes out above our own personal needs. And so sometimes, I don't know if you've been in situations where you feel like you have to look after other people and their needs and forgive them or have compassion for them, but inside you're still going through a process, you're still dealing with it, you're still working through some stuff, and you might have to look after other people instead of yourself, which is a problem, because I'll talk about that in a sec. But this is what it looks like, this kind of compassion, where we are blind, where we put ourselves in harm's way or allow for harm to continue. This is us, the little bird, who is, again, another snake image, in trouble, this poor little bird. And this is, I googled like compassion memes, which are all over the internet, and they're quite hilarious because we often guilt our communities into this idea that we have to have compassion. Otherwise, every minute that we refuse to love one another, another puppy cries, another tear. Oh. So I hope that you can see what's happening with this blind compassion, that it's actually producing an unhealthy way of interacting with others. It's not authentic, it's forced, it's manipulative, it's maybe not dealing with the situation. And we often put ourselves in harm's way by doing this because we don't acknowledge the behaviors that are causing difficulties, and we keep on allowing people to get away with things that cause harm because we're afraid of disrupting the status quo, because we're afraid of confrontation, because we're afraid of creating disharmony in a community. And it's linked to the next topic, which I'll go through very briefly, which are weak boundaries or porous boundaries. And this is something that a lot of spiritual people grapple with, because these are things that allow other people to hurt us as well. Being told that you always need to put yourself last, put others before yourself. This is not how the Buddha taught us to practice. He always said you need to work on yourself first before you can help others. This is the feeling of, giving and giving and giving, but getting nothing back, where other people are forcing you to say yes because you feel like you can't say no. It's how it feels sometimes in groups or at work or in some social situations where you just feel like you're being used, treated like a doormat. Sometimes this comes from wanting to be loved, wanting to be needed, even if it costs us. This is what happens when we get hurt by people that we trust. Feelings of powerlessness, being manipulated, being worthless, being exploited, feeling drained, tired, uncomfortable, sometimes feeling scared or hurt. This is what happens when we don't stand up for our own needs, or we don't create time for ourselves or space. And this is what happens when we have one-sided relationships, friends that only need us for their needs, never listen to our problems or deal with our, or want to do things that we want to do, or work environments that exploit us. We're unable to stop this kind of toxic behavior and we perpetuate really harmful cycles. And one important spiritual tendency is this idea of crazy wisdom, where you have a teacher who can act in whatever way they want to act and hurt, abuse, and belittle and cause a lot of harm. And you're expected to just allow that to happen because it's part of a spiritual growth process that you've been told is happening, and you have this devotion to this leader, and that causes a lot of harm and problems. It's something you see in cults, and it's part of brainwashing. It's where you don't have a boundary to protect yourself, where you give up that boundary and you let people walk all over you like a doormat. I'll just skip through some of these. I will just linger here because this is something that really disturbed me when I read this quote from Gandhi, talking about Hitler and saying, you know, Hitler killed 5 million Jews. It's the greatest crime of our time, but the Jews should have offered themselves to the butcher's knife. They should have thrown themselves into the sea from the cliffs. As it was, they succumbed in their millions. So this is a great spiritual leader saying that people should have just offered themselves up to die. And something like this, of course, is really problematic. And of course, it comes from Gandhi's nonviolence and nonviolent philosophy. But when you read those things, you kind of think, this is slightly dangerous to think like this, that we should just allow other people to treat us however they want, that we should just allow people to harm us, allow people to hurt us, that we shouldn't have any boundaries around our own safety and our own dignity. And this is something that we need to be aware of when we're in a spiritual community, where we from time to time might need to relax our boundaries in order to be comfortable with others, to make others feel comfortable, where we might need to let down our guard in order for us to be vulnerable and to share, or to expose parts of ourselves that need to be expressed. And this is really difficult. If we've got really strong boundaries, we won't let anyone in. We'll put up that wall that we saw at the beginning. But if we have really weak boundaries, we'll just invite people in who might treat us well with respect and care for us, or they might hurt us and cause us suffering. And so boundaries are really important, especially in spiritual communities. We need to be aware of what our teachers are asking from us. We need to be aware of what our companions in the spiritual life are expecting from us. We need to be aware of our own personal boundaries and how we negotiate our own personal spiritual journey, and not allow other people to push back our boundaries where we're not comfortable, or to intrude on places where we need some space, where we need some distance from others. So blind compassion, weak boundaries, these two things kind of go together. and anger, phobia, and the other one, which I can't remember because it's been a long time of talking, also things that we need to work on. And we did have this idea that we were going to do another breakout session, but I'm wondering if we've run out of time. Can someone who's in charge tell me?
Yes, Banta, we've gone about 10 minutes over time. It's
Oh,
10
already
past.
over time.
10
Okay,
past
so we'll
the
have
hour,
to.
yeah.
Oh, forgive me. I really wanted to let people talk and to for people to have that opportunity to interact with other people on the call, but we'll have to wait for that tomorrow. So I'll try to make sure that there's time allocated for that important part tomorrow, where we'll be exploring the shadow side of spirituality. We'll be looking at cognitive dissonance. We'll be looking at this lopsided cognitive development where we value intellectual understanding of spirituality over our emotional understanding. We'll be looking at premature transcendence, this idea that we might not be as far down the spiritual path as we like to believe we are, and that we shouldn't try to be further down the spiritual path. We should try to be where we're at on our spiritual path. And the last one is a deluded sense of attainment, and this idea that we might be, we might have some sort of enlightenment when we don't. So let's save that for tomorrow. And sorry for going over time. And I hope that the things that we've covered today make sense and that you benefited from the presentation, maybe enjoyed the memes. And I thank you for being here and for being open and taking this opportunity to reflect upon your spiritual practice. Because I think when we do that, we have a much better chance to deal with the things that we need to deal with, and a much better chance to be happy and to create happiness in our lives and in the lives of other people. So thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, same time.